Can everyone hear me? Great. Thanks, John, for that introduction, and thanks for making me read Origin. It's a gift. I still teach out of these books, including John also had us read Confessions of Augustine, and I still use my freshman copy, which is one of the most exceedingly embarrassing things that a professor can do, is look at your freshman year notes, your 18-year-old musings on Augustine, which I do regularly as an opportunity to remind my students that you can be very wrong and actually keep a record of how wrong you are. So I'm here to speak this morning about a sacramental apologetics. And perhaps you said, that title makes no sense to me, but I'm here anyway, so I'm going to come to the talk. So I'm going to sort of explain what I mean. And I want to explain what I mean through both a combination of a sort of discussion of secularization and what actually constitutes secularization. And I'm also going to look at then responses to this secularization today. I know that we are all familiar with these stats, but sometimes it's helpful to remind ourselves that in the 5 years since I've directed, really 6 years now, directed the Center for Liturgy, according to Kara, here are the declines that should be particularly concerning to us. Infant baptism is down by 14%. Confirmations are down after rising from 1960. Confirmations in the 60s were actually sort of rather low and then increased and then have started this decline. First communions are down by 10%, and marriages are down by 11%, dropping actually 4.5% just last year. Mass attendance has mostly held steady, but I'd like to say that it's not going to. It's not going to because of those numbers right here. So that 24%, which has maintained itself primarily, we already see amongst millennials a much lower number than that. Amongst emerging adults, 18 to 23 years old, we see mass attendance, an active Catholic. 9% of 18 to 23-year-olds will attend Mass once a month, which is the most active Catholic that we can imagine. It's under 1% for once a week. Now, of course, you know millennials who attend Mass more than that, but that's the problem with sort of sociology is that the people you know are different than the people you don't know. So this is the reality. And what is the cause of it? And I think Cardinal Willett, in a recent book, suggests that actually the task ahead of us, I'd like to suggest that actually what happens, of course, there's a lack of commitment. Again and again here I've heard properly that there's a lack of desire or perhaps an attempt. One is distant from Catholic culture, Catholic existence, and so the sacraments don't mean anything. But I'd actually like to say the sacraments don't mean anything because actually I'd like to say that there's something about the sacraments as a whole that don't make sense to the modern person. It's the sacraments as a whole that don't make sense. And so Cardinal Willett notes this and says, modernity severed the link between soul and body, intellect and the senses, faith and the sacraments. The need for a reality such as the sacraments lost its obviousness once modern Enlightenment philosophy limited religious progress to an ever greater spiritualization of religion, which has to be purified of every relation to the senses and to matter. Liberal theology limits itself to this vision and demands a moral justification for the entirety of Christian reality, to the detriment of the sacramental dimension of Christianity. In this context, whether you call it postmodern or late modern, as I prefer to, we have to justify the why of the sacraments. It's not enough to explain their how within a universe of meaning that no longer exists. In this sense, I always think the problem we have with, for example, young people, young parents, is not to say, go to Mass. Go to Mass. We urge you, go to Mass. And their response internally is, why? Why? What is it within the sacrament of the Eucharist that is necessary for a flourishing human existence in the world? I'm happy. My friends, most of whom have left the church in some way, are happy. Now, maybe they're not ultimately happy, they're not sort of existentially happy, there's desires that they don't know how to deal with, but they love Sunday mornings at home. And to be honest, as a parent of a 3-year-old, sometimes I would love Sunday mornings at home. Why do I go? A strong sense of Irish Catholic guilt, so deep to my identity that it cannot be erased. And in some ways, I think that what's particularly disturbing to this about us is the hope that those in liturgical theology before the Second Vatican Council had about what the liturgy could do. When you read these texts from the 20s and the 30s emerging from Lambert Baudouin or Virgil Michael in the United States, you read hopes that are actually kind of beautiful, but perhaps too hopeful. That the renewal of the liturgy will end secularization and individualism, and it will also end racism, and it will end everything that's bad in the world, if only we chant the propers together. And I think this was an overblown hope, and it was actually one that I think was articulated by Romano Guardini in his letter to the German bishops in 1963. The question is whether the wonderful opportunities open to the liturgy will achieve their full realization, whether we'll be satisfied with just removing anomalies, taking new situations into account, giving better instructions on the meaning of ceremonies and liturgical vessels, or whether we'll relearn a forgotten way of doing things and recapture lost attitudes. That is, the kind of formation that we needed after the council was the formation of a person. And the liturgy was integral to this, but it was part of it. And amongst a certain generation of liturgical scholars, many of whom are my colleagues, this broader ecology was forgotten. This broader ecology of the formation of Christian existence was not carried out at the expense of assuming that the liturgy would do everything. And thus, it's really painful for them to see what's going on. And I think, in some ways, it's the problem of secularization that we have not ever taken, or we've never taken seriously enough. And by secularization, I read ecclesial documents, and secularization is mentioned frequently, and Cardinal Wuerl noted that the Synod mentioned it. But what is it? Is it the separation of ecclesial power and political power? Is that secularization? Well, in some ways, yes, but in others, as far as our problem, no. Jose Casanova, in his Religions in the Modern World, notes very clearly that actually the separation of ecclesial power and state power has resulted in stunning religious movements. I mean, think about the annual March for Life. Actually, the March for Life can work so effectively because precisely it operates as a kind of marginal group. Is it the European phenomenon that will spread all over the world, in which religious consciousness will be lost because we have developed the right intellectual knowing? Science has taught us to know aright. But of course, we know that this is not true because religion is alive and well. In fact, much of our sort of geopolitical conflicts today are around precisely this issue. Or is it, as Charles Taylor notes in A Secular Age, that the problem of modernity is that for the first time, you don't have to choose religion. You don't have to believe in God, that there are options available to you. And Taylor's thesis is interesting, but it still doesn't answer enough for us, which is, indeed, there are options, but why are people choosing no? Taylor doesn't answer that except sort of indirectly by mentioning French poets at the very end of the book. Why? What is it that actually is the problem? I'd like to posit that the problem is memory. Secularization is fundamentally a loss of remembering. In her work, Danielle Heuvel-Léger, Religion as a Chain of Memory, she discusses the precise problem of religion as a chain of memory. The problem of transmission, whether in cultural or religion, is not a problem of failure to adjust to the educational methods used to transmit a body of knowledge. It's linked to the collapse of the framework of collective memory, which provided every individual with the possibility of a link between what comes before and his or her own actual experience. The question of secularization takes on a new form, that of the possibility and plausibility of a group being able, within a context of memory reduced to fragments, to recognize itself as a link in a chain of belief and entrusted with the task of extending that chain into the future. So, religion functions as a kind of connection to the past whereby the present can be understood. It's this chain. And when you cut the chain, and you cut the chain, and you cut the chain, and religion now becomes a series of moralistic therapeutic deism, and no one knows about Chalcedon, and no one knows to fast on Fridays, and no one knows this, and no one knows that, and then you hand people these 4 fragments and say, here. They say, those are 4 interesting fragments. Those are 4 interesting fragments. What do they mean? And this is not just a problem for religion, friends. This is a problem of the modern condition par excellence. I love to go to cities like New Orleans and Boston. And the reason I like, and Philadelphia, because there's a place there. It's a place. The existence of a city is a memory place. When you walk through the French Quarter in New Orleans at an appropriate hour, as I do, buildings exist that have a history. Smells exist that have a history. This is a place. Yet, if we think about how Americans treat our cities, or our small towns or our villages, they're not as places. Buildings are raised in a moment. There's no place there. And there's no history, there's no memory, there's no connection to something that comes before you. Though Walmart, I don't have Walmart up here just to sort of insult Walmart. I was raised in East Tennessee, and we had lots of Walmarts, and that's where I shopped when I was a kid. But the Walmart where we had left to build a bigger Walmart, which became something else, which is now being torn down, which will become something else. And if you are like me and you drive through these areas with these big box stores, you feel almost suffocated because you're in a place that's not a place. Where are you? I could be anywhere. And the same problem exists within sort of media, and Brett will talk about this later. So I only need to say one thing, which is the way terrible things have been said in this election. I don't think I have to inform anyone of that. They will disappear within 15 minutes. There will be some that remember them, but the stories dissipate because the way that electronic media works is that it comes and goes. It comes and goes. It comes and goes. The new story, and there's forgetfulness. And you see this, of course, in educational systems. I don't have to tell you. I'm sure you hear from your teachers, and you've encountered this in your seminarians. They don't know things. They don't know things. There's no memory of a tradition. So this is not just a Catholic problem. This is actually a modern problem. And I think we're seeing it actually play out in our political institutions as much as we're seeing it play out in our church. There's no memory of a kind of national identity built on something besides consumption and profit. So what happens in religion when this occurs? Well, when institutions can no longer pass on this memory, religious desire doesn't disappear because human beings have a desire for God. It doesn't entirely disappear. It takes different fragmented paths. And one of these is actually an emphasis on religious affection. That if a tradition can no longer sustain me, what can sustain me is an experience. And so we see this happening, I think, particularly amongst youth ministry, and I see this happening amongst my students. So they'll say something like this. I've done interviews in the past for some of our programs, and I'll ask our undergraduates, how do you pray? And they're like, oh, that's a great question. Well, I used to pray the Our Father. And I prayed the Our Father because my parents told me to pray the Our Father. And then after a while, then I learned to really pray. Because I was just praying the words my parents gave me. But I didn't really pray until I went on this youth group trip, until I went here, I went there. Now, of course, to take up one's tradition is a necessity of adolescence if you want it to be sustained. But the dismissal of merely praying the Our Father is problematic. I just used to pray this prayer that has been passed on from Jesus. No big deal. I just used to pray this prayer that my parents actually sort of taught us in the evenings because they cared enough to do so. It's a dismissal of tradition, and affectivity reigns supreme, which is why I have massive concerns with Catholic evangelization in this country, because we exist in such a culture by this sort of individual desire to encounter something on our own. Think of Thoreau. I went to the woods so that I would not find that I had not lived. That there's such a concern here that what happens when the affections die, and that's when I end up encountering students who say, my faith is down right now. I need to go on a week-long retreat again. And I say, well, are you praying? No, I'm not praying. Okay, just pray. Retreat would be beautiful, but you're not having a dark night of the soul. You're not praying. It's simpler than that. But they want this affection. They actually think that this encounter with Christ, which I'll talk about in a moment, is this affection. They think it is that the encounter is the having of that affection, which is a disaster over the long haul. Which is what I was just saying. It's actually, this has been critiqued in our tradition from a variety of strands. Blessed John Henry Newman, in dealing with evangelicalism in England in his parochial and plain sermons, notes, one secret act of self-denial, one sacrifice of inclination to duty is worth all the mere good thoughts, warm feelings, passionate prayers in which idle people indulge themselves. Because Newman saw that the rise of Methodism within his own context and the Moravians would actually lead to eventually the end of the sacraments and the end of the scriptures. Because if the affection is what matters, then the institution doesn't. If the affection is what's important, then the institution can disappear. And John of the Cross, which I just taught to my students, if you desire me to answer with a word of comfort, behold, my son subject me and to others out of love for me, and you will see how much he answers. If you desire me to declare some secret truths or events to you, fix your eyes on him, and you will discern hidden in him the most secret mysteries and wisdom and wonders of God. So the sacraments must be a personal encounter, but they have to have an objectivity to their encounter. It's not simply the affections. When we talk about a personal encounter in the sacraments, we don't mean simply your affections are raised. There's an objectivity to the personal encounter, and one must experience it, and affections are involved. But the affections are not the encounter. The encounter is the encounter. And I think actually there's an interesting study to be done in the church about where the language of personal encounter comes to be taken up in these documents, including in Benedict XVI. And it comes uniquely from Luigi Giussani. And if you read Luigi Giussani's works, you have a much richer sense of what personal encounter consists of. It's not American, me and Jesus encounter. It actually is a global sense of community and divine love and sharing in a humanizing encounter in which you encounter the divine love of God through the church, through friendship, through the mystery of the sacraments. So, what is this sacramental apologetics? And I'll go relatively quickly here and leave time mostly for conversation. Cardinal Wuerl noted something about, I wanted to say one last thing about secularization in the church. And what I love about Pope Francis's recent documents is that he doesn't simply turn his eye on the world to critique the world, but he actually turns the eye also on the life of the church. Because the church can become worldly. And one area where I think we have to think about is the language. If we think about a chain of memory as connecting us to a past, then the hermeneutics of rupture have been deadly for this. Because I often hear this, everything Pope Francis does is a revolution. Everything he does is the first time that this has been done. And our own media are picking this up. I mean, every time Pope Francis releases a document, it's a revolutionary document. We can't have that many revolutions. No, I'm not saying that Pope Francis isn't pushing the church in a specific direction, but also St. Francis did, and so did Pius X, and so did others. So the hermeneutic of continuity or reform isn't about being a progressive or a conservative. It's about realizing that if you're going to say that the thing that happened at Vatican II is the thing that is the most important thing that has ever happened in the church, then you begin the history of the church in 1962. Which means you cut off people from the greater chain of memory. And perhaps there's some ways in which the Second Vatican Council was instituted, and I'll make some of these suggestions, that actually has led to this process of secularization. You can disagree with me on that, but I will say it. So how do we rebuild this chain of memory? And I think we were talking about this yesterday, so I'll be very brief with it, which is integral to this is the kerygma and a renewal of preaching at all levels. I think our seminaries, though well-intentioned, have set up a defunct model of how to teach preaching. On one end, you have historical critical exegesis, which I think needs to happen. I'm with Pope Benedict in Jesus of Nazareth. He uses it. But you have historical critical exegesis on one hand, and then you have a preaching class on another, and you expect that suddenly you move from in addition also to private prayer of the text on one's own. So what you're asking these young men to do, whether they're deacon candidates, whether they're seminarians, is, and I know this, by the way, I'm writing this column for OSV, and it's the most complicated thing I've ever done. I have always been hard on preachers, but now in August, I'm not hard on you, because I started paying attention to what the Gospel of Luke was for 5 weeks. And I was imagining, everyone's on vacation on the East Coast, and they're showing up to your parish, and it's, you're describing like, I'd like to describe this merchant who cheats, but who is praised by Jesus. So it's hard. But we're not actually setting up so that this kerygma can be proclaimed in any way that seems real. And yesterday, something was said about a certain way of rhetoric. Bishop Flores said it. And I think it's actually key, is that I don't hear preachers preach the gospel as if it's real, often enough. I hear things like, as the Gospel of John says, as if the Gospel of John is just any old text in the world. I don't hear preachers who've memorized the narrative enough. They're so attached to the lectionary that they can't move outside of it. They can't tell the broader story, so you end up sort of at a myopic focus. I don't hear preachers, my students, when I play them the Exultet, they love it. Every one of my students, religious, non-religious, they love it. They say, that constant refrain, this is the night. This is the night. This is the night. is what people long for. They don't care to... Christmas isn't the day that Jesus was born and one says, "Happy birthday, Jesus." It's the day in which to be human is forever changed. To be human is to never be the same. So I think we need a reform of our preaching in seminaries. We need to, preaching should involve a history of sermons. It should immersion in patristic exegesis. It needs something more that needs to be done because we need this connection to the text as a lived reality in the life of the church. And this is part of the problem with the sacraments. Because the students I work with don't think the sacraments work because they have no sense that the reality of what took place in Christ is happening here and now. They don't have that sense. Jesus is a good guy from a long time ago. There also has to be something about the sacraments. I say here existential, but I want to use another term, exigence. Sophia Cavalletti, in her work, The Religious Potential of the Child, describes that religious education can't be about experience, because experience is dead and gone once it's there. It happens and then you're gone. She's using Italian, so she's making a distinction. But it has to be about exigent. It has to meet not where the person's at. I always love the pastoral line, meet someone where they're at, but that's actually kind of wrong. You meet them where they want to go. If I meet my students where they're at, I just keep them there. If I teach to the lowest 10%, all my students go to the lowest 10%. I teach where they need to go. What is the desire, the unfulfilled need that they most have at the present? And how can the sacraments be taught differently for each of these groups? So when I work with undergraduates at Notre Dame, they want to participate in the world. Their greatest desire is to leave here and do great things. And they go to Mass primarily because they love Jesus, the ones that do. They encounter Christ in the real presence. But they don't actually get a connection between liturgical prayer and their life. And they're going to end up having children, and they're going to have to explain to their children what they're doing. And so an exigence I found essential to undergraduates is this return gift of sacrifice that is part of the Eucharistic narrative. I convince my students the importance of the Eucharist, actually not because of real presence, which I do teach them in its totality. They kind of broadly know real presence, even the badly formed ones. They can't explain transubstantiation. They know that Jesus is there. What they don't know is that they're to offer their very lives as a logica latria, as a reasonable offering to the Lord, as Pope Benedict notes in Spirit of the Liturgy. So look, O Lord, upon the sacrifice which you yourself have provided for your church, and grant in your loving kindness to all who partake of this one body and one chalice, that gathered into one body by the Holy Spirit, they may truly become a living sacrifice in Christ to the praise of your glory. This kind of imagery then can be taken up in vocational discernment. I always tell my students that the sacraments are so important to our existence because they actually help us find our vocation. I tell my students who are discerning priesthood, sometimes they'll ask a question, like, do I have a call? And I say, yeah, you have a call. But how do you know where you want to give your life entirely away? Because the language of call sometimes has the accidental effect of relying upon affect. Because they imagine I have a call because I feel something, and then I don't feel it, so I don't have a call. Then I feel it again, I have a call. Then I don't, so then I do, and call becomes this interior sort of subjective reality. But the call that we have is to give our lives radically away as a sacrifice as a return gift of offering to the divine love that's fully revealed in the Eucharistic life of the church. And I tell my students, if you give your life away at every moment, if you say fiat, then you will find your vocation. This reaches them, and then the Eucharist has a distinctive meaning. And I'm not just making this up. I've given this talk to high school students, 12,000 high school students over the year. And they always say that this is the first time they understand the Eucharist. So I'm not just making this up, though I could be. And the same thing is true of marriage. I have 90 students in a course on the sacrament of marriage this semester. And it would have been larger, but the room was 90. It's not because I'm a great teacher. It's because they don't know what marriage is. And they're really interested in it because they want to get married, many of them. They don't know how to date. So I actually have assigned an assignment, extra credit, that they have to ask someone out on a date. And they have to go out for 2 hours with someone at a place where you have an hour and a half face-to-face conversation with someone. And you have to let them know it's a date. It can't be like I hang out with you and I see what happens, which is how our undergraduates date right now. You have to say, like, will you go out with me? Because they want love. And when I was teaching them about the church's position on homosexuality, the only way they got it was actually through teaching them the existential nature of marriage as a sacrament. This is my favorite preface to a Eucharistic prayer. There are other beautiful ones, but this one means a lot to me as a married man. For in him you've made a new covenant with your people, so that as you've redeemed man and woman by the mystery of Christ's death and resurrection, so in Christ you might make them partakers of divine nature and joint heirs with him of heavenly glory. In the union of husband and wife, you give a sign of Christ's loving gift of grace, so that the sacraments we celebrate might draw us more deeply into the wondrous design of your love. When I share this with my students, they say, that's marriage? I thought it was like a ceremony or a broad commitment of love. And when I tell them, actually, your natural love has been taken up into divine love, and you become an image to the world of Christ and the church. They're actually more afraid of marriage, ironically, which is good. But that there's a sense, these images matter to them. The images, we presume that they have the imagination, that they know the basics, because we do. But they don't. Inculcating bodily practice, I can go quickly through this. I think the elimination of the Friday fast was a disaster. And I think it was a disaster for this reason. Because what matters to people are the way a memory is passed on is through the body. The way that I remember things is through the body. Kneeling isn't some internal expression where I say, I love Jesus, therefore I shall kneel. Rather, I kneel, and my body is marked with the reality of divine worship. I know it after years of practicing it. And one of the things that we did after the Second Vatican Council is we emphasized this cognitive dimension, I think, of let someone choose the practice that they most want, instead of saying we need practices that can mark the memory of divine love upon our bodies. This memory is carried out. And so I fast, as well as many other students here, on Friday from meat. And we don't do this because we're conservative reactionaries who want to overturn the council. Or at least I don't think most of us are. We do it because what does it mean to remember Christ's passion on Friday? Well, it means praying Psalm 51. It means going out to lunch with your friends and saying, oh, I can't eat that. It becomes written upon one's identity. And I would say the same with processions. I've been involved in a variety of parishes who say, like, well, the liturgy is what really matters. Everything else doesn't matter as much. We just need to focus on the liturgy. And we missed out on the kind of writing upon the body. And if there's any gift, I should say, of Spanish-speaking Catholicism in the United States, it's going to be this continual sort of refusal, a reminder to us European white Catholics that the body matters. The body matters. And we've lost this. And I think this is exactly how we rebuild this sort of sacramental culture, is by once again rebuilding the body. And I'll say just two last things. The first is a renewal of wonder. I think we've said again and again here, beauty matters. And when I often say this to other groups, they'll say, well, Europe has lots of beautiful churches and they're empty. What does it matter? But we're not talking just about getting people back in the church. What we're talking about, in the end, rebuilding a culture. So yes, we need the kerygma. Yes, we need people to have a commitment to the kerygma. But we also need a place for people like Thomas Merton and Dorothy Day to wander in off the streets of New York City and say, that. We need a place where children can learn this memory from the youngest age. My 3-year-old son can't understand a single homily, which may be good for him. But he does love incense, and he does love light, and he loves chant. And he loves to sing chant. He's very loud with the singing and out of tune. He loves this, and actually it immerses himself in Mass. He pays better attention at Mass than I do. This materiality matters. And the images that we present to people that build a culture, I think we need to really seriously look as Catholics at the hymns that we sing. And I think we need a serious study of the theological content of the hymns that we sing, because at this stage, what sort of images are we bestowing? Are we creating desire? And I'm not saying that we have to return to solely chant or polyphony, which I love, but that's not my argument. My argument is, would I rather sing a new church, or would I rather sing the church's one foundation, ironically an Anglican hymn? And what is it that the images that are bestowed to my imagination that enable me to sort of contemplate this reality? And when I teach a course here on liturgy, theology, and aesthetics, my students are angry that the church has held back this patrimony from them. They always say to me, I didn't know Palestrina existed. I didn't know, can you give me music? I've never heard any of this. I'm teaching a course on manuscripts next semester with someone who actually knows how to read manuscripts. And it will be a full course because students want to touch old stuff. Lastly, if we want to rebuild this culture, there's something about a mystical task that's needed. I'm all for forming communities of communities. I'm all for small group Christian communities are necessary. Conversation and friendship are necessary. But there's some desire of the modern person for something that isn't just technocratic. And a lot of countries have started doing something called night fever, which I would love to have renamed to something that doesn't sound so weird, but where they open their churches in the middle of their downtown area when young adults are going out at night, and they light candles, and they have music, and they have spiritual counseling, and they have confession, and they do a sort of liturgical event that isn't simply Mass, which, by the way, is high-level work if you're returning to the church. There's a lot of that is a high commitment event. But wandering into a church that's lit with candles, which reaches this desire, which is, by the way, why people still go to Europe and wander through these churches, right? And stand in silence. I mean, I don't know how, every time I go to St. Peter's, as if I do that all the time. Some of you do, but I don't. I marvel at these random assemblage of secular human beings who suddenly stand before height and say nothing. They don't actually say anything. So there's this sense in which if our evangelization efforts don't have this mystical dimension, then it won't be sacramental, and we won't rebuild this sacramental dimension. And we need this mystical dimension in every level. Our youth groups can't simply be occasions in which there's praise, in which there's the totality of effective praise without this silent encounter with the bridegroom. They crave it. So that is what I have for you all. This is just what we do here at the center. But I wanted to, for the next, we have plenty of time for questions or comments. But I wanted to thank you for listening and allowing me to just say a variety of things to you that you can reject.